Hello, everyone. Welcome to Colorado Reptile Educators. My name is Troy Bumgardner, and I am one of the three partners of the Colorado Reptile Educators. I have a background of reptile zoology. I'm currently a reptile zookeeper at a local zoo, and experienced keeper and breeder within the hobby as well. Jz.
Nope, I'm Jz. I'm a small batch reptile breeder. Mostly I'm a snake guy, as well as I have moved towards full-time reptile education, both via YouTube and in-person shows at private events, as well as larger reptile expos and public events and fairs and things.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lori Torrini. I own Behavior Education LLC, and I'm also the director of Spirit Keeper Animal Sanctuary. I'm a certified professional animal trainer through CPDT and Fear Free Pets. And I also have a certificate in applied animal behavior through the University of Washington, as well as an Associate of Science in Zookeeping. And I started my experience with dogs, cats, and horses. And over the years, I've worked with multiple species of both domestic pets and livestock and a few zoo animals. And the last 5 years, I've really been focused on snake training and behavior. So welcome to our show, which we hope is going to be educational for you. And along those lines, we're going to start with Jz doing a herpetology news item for us.
All right. So I actually had an entirely different one set up and ready to go. It was about how we all know that scientists will mimic animals and nature to try to recreate that in robotics, and they were trying to base a new robot on the paradise flying snake about their little movements. However, just today I came across a new one which has to do with what Lori and I talked about on one of our meetings, which was whether or not snakes are actually secondary seed propagators. So as we know that there are quite a few animals out there, birds, bats, and then very famously in South America, the agouti, that all eat nuts, and then they will actually pass it through their system, and then they will actually, in their travels, produce the seeds out the other end, which will help germinate and continue to spread and grow vegetation in the forests. Well, they actually started back in 2018 a study that concluded in 2020, and then it took them a little while to conclude their findings because of COVID and everything, that in essentially a university in partnership with the Chiricahua Desert Museum, the Phoenix Zoo, and the Desert Flower Museum in Arizona did a study where they took Western diamondbacks as well as two other species of colubrids, a desert king snake and a snoring gopher snake, where they actually inserted different seeds of plants that are found in that region, where these snakes are found in that region, in frozen thawed laboratory mice, and then did a study as well as a blind partner study with that to see whether or not they would actually pass through the system of the snakes in that mouse to kind of recreate in the wild, where like a rodent would be grabbing the seeds and then storing them in their food pouches, and then they get eaten by the snake. And they found that in Western diamondbacks, it was something close to 84% of the seeds actually did manage to pass entirely through the snake and began to germinate. In the desert king snake and the snoring gopher snake, it was significantly less. But they have found that in these particular areas where in Arizona, where they were trying to figure out their study, the Western diamondback is the most populous snake in these areas. So there is very good evidence to suggest that Western diamondbacks are not only great for, pest control for people, it also helps germinate and spread the flora part of the flora and fauna of the natural world.
That is great, because we did just talk about this when we did a little conservation piece. Jz helped me do a little conservation episode for my channel and for something I was doing for college. And we talked about this specifically. So thank you for that news item. That's really cool. One of the things that we want to share with you on our show is some term related to zoology or herpetology. And I actually researched a term which I forgot when we started the show, but just remembered. So you're going to get two terms today. You're going to get microclimate and you're going to get ectotherm or ectothermy. And so I'm going to talk to you about what microclimate means, and it'll be really quick. Microclimate is the combination of two words, micro and climate. They both originate from the original Greek, And they were first used in the 1500s. And micro means something that's very, very, very tiny or small. And climate is an overall long-term weather pattern for an area or region. So where weather is, it might be rainy this morning and sunny this afternoon. Climate is this area or region tends to be warm most of the time, or has seasons where there's a winter, spring, summer, and fall. And so when you combine micro with climate, what it means for us in herpetology is that animals live in a region where there is an overall climate, like a temperate climate or a humid climate or a warm or cold climate. But the animals that actually live there, like snakes and other reptiles, can find microclimates. So very, very tiny areas in their specific region where the climate may differ completely from the overall climate. So in a very, very humid region, a reptile might choose a very, very dry microclimate to get away from the humidity, or vice versa. And Jz is actually going to talk to you about a specific microclimate later today. So Troy, talk to us about what ectothermy is.
Yeah, so it's kind of a basic term in regards to reptile care, reptile husbandry, reptile biology. But some of you might not be familiar with it. But I do bet you that majority of you are familiar with the word cold-blooded. Well, cold-blooded is very close relation to the word ectothermy. Where the word ectothermy comes from, ecto kind of meaning outside, and thermo or thermy is in relation to temperature, right? So you're probably familiar with thermometer or things like that. Same relation to temperature, but when you put those two words together, it's meaning outside temperature. And in the world of reptiles, where most reptiles are ectothermic, that means that they have to rely on outside sources, outside heat sources, in order to maintain their body temperature. Most reptiles, because of their metabolic rates, they are not able to generate their own body heat like mammals and humans are, right? We are homeothermic, which is a type of endothermy or inside temperature where we can generate our own body heat because of our metabolism. But reptiles do not have the ability to do so. And so they have to thermoregulate or seek out heat sources, and then retreat to cold or colder areas in order to maintain their internal core body temperature and maintain that ideal metabolic rate. So my goal for everyone is to stop using the word cold-blooded, because these animals do not have cold blood, and start using the word ectothermic or ectotherm.
Okay, so we're going to move now right into Jz's next segment, which is about a particular microclimate. So Jz, what microclimate did you choose to share with us today?
All right. So today I'm going to talk about one of the most commonly kept pet reptiles in the hobby, at least here in the States, and that is the corn snake. So as Lori previously explained, a microclimate is a smaller area where it is an entirely separate climate due to different reasons than the outside habitat around it. And the term microclimate can be applied from anything as small as an area under a rock to several square kilometers. For instance, the side of a hill where the sun doesn't often hit it nearly as long, so temperatures are usually cooler. Oftentimes there's more humidity surrounding the other parts of the other side of the mountain or the area around it. It would be a little bit drier, more arid. And then in a large scale, for instance, there are pockets of the Pacific Northwest, like in Northern California, where even just about 10 miles south, it's much warmer, think, sunny California weather. But as you move further up the Pacific Northwest into that Northern Canada area, those large conifer redwood trees actually help insulate and create a little bit of a heat pocket called a heat island. And that entire area in those pockets actually insulates that extra hot heat from around them. So it makes the temperatures cooler and it makes the humidity go up. So that's why when you actually go into, Redwoods National Park, it's a little bit cooler. You're always seeing people wearing jackets and it's a lot more humid in those areas. And as it was pointed out before, a lot of the times the reptiles that we keep occupy these individual microclimates. So for instance, the corn snake. found throughout most of the southeastern part of the United States, even all the way far north as New Jersey. And then during their period of activity, when they are not in a period of brumation or activity because it's too cold or too hot, during those months in their range, they experience temperatures between over 100 degrees and below 55 degrees. So every single animal, including reptiles, have preferred optimum temperature preference or range. So a POTR. And in that over 100 to 55 degree range, a lot of those animals, the corn snakes specifically, will occupy little pockets of hillsides, of shaded areas, of overgrowth, of old growth forests many times, to where it's not quite as warm. The humidity is a little bit better for them. And so in captivity, what we try to do, because in the wild, they have the ability to go in and out of these different areas to seek humidity, to seek hides, to cryptobast, to find through, because they are ectothermic, they have to regulate their body temperatures to be able to bask and to get away hot and cool. In captivity, we take that away from them. So what our job now, playing deity for these guys, is we have to be able to recreate and try to hit their POTR, the preferred optimum temperature range. And so for a corn snake, that's where we're usually shooting for 70 to 85-ish from the cool to hot side. So a basking temperature with full spectrum lighting of ultraviolet A and ultraviolet B light, where they can bask a little bit with multiple hides on the hot side, and then enough room for them to be able to move away into a cooler side, as well as, again, with those humid hides, using different things like cypress mulch, or using coconut or eco-coir or eco-earth, or whatever the different commercial products there are these days, all helps to add for them to be able to hopefully be able to exhibit and use their natural behaviors while maintaining an optimal temperature for them in this one particular microclimate. Or even though if you were to go out and find a corn snake, if you were to fly down to Miami, it could be 100 degrees on that tarmac. Once you leave the city, because those like heat islands, those little bubbles of heat, you leave the actual city, it drops down in temperature. And then you find a little nature preserve where there's a lot of old growth forest, that temp drops even more. And that's where you're going to find the largest amounts of corn snakes being active during those time periods. They can exist outside of there, but it can be very stressful for the animals. So that's why we try to maintain that microclimate in captivity in the enclosures that we can provide for them.
So Jz, even though a whole enclosure could be considered a microclimate, separate from the larger climate wherever people are living with their corn snakes, you can still create even more microclimates within the reptile enclosure, like human hide would be an example of that, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And so that's where the term cluttering comes from in a lot of the different hobbies, is where they use different hides that we can add humidity to with the use of that sphagnum moss and things. So that way it provides the animal to, when it wants to be a little bit more humid, a little bit more cool, a little bit more warm, dry in that individual habitat, they can seek those out.
Perfect. Thanks, Jz. That was great. Now we're going to move on to nutrition, and Troy is going to talk to us about some topic related to reptile nutrition. What have you got for us today, Troy?
Yeah, so today I wanted to touch on one that a lot of us are probably very familiar with, but is something that is very, very important within the reptile industry, and that is the vitamin D3. It has become a very, very hot topic in the reptile community in regards to offering ultraviolet light, or allowing reptiles to synthesize that vitamin D3 and allowing it to more reptiles, in regards to, not just lizards like we have done in the past, but offering to snakes and nocturnal animals and things like that. But the vitamin D3 is a very interesting and very crucial vitamin in regards to reptiles. Vitamin D3 is a fat soluble vitamin that when is offered to reptiles, it actually allows them to balance out the calcium levels within the blood calcium levels, and so they can have healthy calcium levels within their body. And so how we offer the vitamin D3 to reptiles, we can do it in multiple different ways, either a natural way or a synthetic way. The natural way is through utilizing ultraviolet B lighting or UVB lighting. And through UVB, it produces these provitamin Ds or precursors of vitamin D. And then in addition to heat, it is converted to vitamin D3 within the reptile's body. That vitamin D3 then moves through the reptile's blood plasma and moves into the liver, where it is converted into calcidiol. And then that calcidiol is spread throughout the body. And then again moves through the blood plasma into the kidneys, where it's converted into calcitrol. And that calcitrol is what allows for the reptiles to maintain that healthy blood calcium levels and give them the ability to absorb calcium better. And so what happens, well, let me backtrack. The other way to offer vitamin D3 into reptiles is the synthetic way, and that is through our calcium supplements, or the little powder that you can get at reptile shops or Petco or PetSmart. And that vitamin D3 is a synthetic form, and we just put it on the animal's food, and that is how it is introduced into the reptile's body, is when they consume it. But what's interesting is that it is still pretty common in the practice to utilize UVB and supplement with powdered supplements, powdered vitamin D3. So what happens when you don't offer any vitamin D3 to your reptiles? This can actually lead to hyperthyroidism in reptiles, or a vitamin D3 deficiency, which doesn't allow them to absorb calcium or metabolize calcium, which can lead to metabolic bone disease. Yeah, and I'm throwing a bunch of big words out there, but metabolic bone disease is like rickets in humans. It is where their bones become very soft and brittle, and they warp and bend and break, and ultimately can cause the life of the animal. So vitamin D3 and calcium is very, very crucial to reptiles' health. Without it, they can and potentially will die. So it's very important to offer it. But what happens when we potentially offer too much? Because like I was saying, it's very common practice nowadays to offer both UV lighting and a powdered supplement. Well, reptiles have a self-regulating process or system that allows them, when they synthesize this vitamin D3 through UV light, they have a self-regulating process where they can actually turn it off when they have enough vitamin D3 in their system. However, if we're offering both UV light and synthesized vitamin D3 through a powdered supplement, we have the potential to overdose our animals with vitamin D3, or potentially expose them to hypercalcemia, where they have too much calcium or too much vitamin D3 in the system. And what this can cause is actually calcification of organs like the kidney, liver, stomach, things like that, where those organs actually turn to stone, if you will, or turn to rock, because there's too much calcium or too much vitamin D3 in the body. And like I said earlier, vitamin D3 is a fat-soluble vitamin, which means that it is very, very hard to expel excess vitamin D3. Pretty much the only way to get rid of it is through burning fat, which we all know that is very, very hard to do. Well, it's even more difficult in reptiles because of their slow metabolic rate and their ability to conserve energy, resources, and fat stores. So long story short, we need to be offering vitamin D3 to our reptiles, but we need to be cautious about over-supplementation. So ideally, if you're offering the correct amounts of UV lighting to your reptiles, they do have the ability to synthesize the perfect amount of vitamin D3, and you, in theory, should never have to supplement with a powdered supplement.
For
Yes.
snakes and reptiles like lizards that eat whole prey, are they getting vitamin D3 from the whole prey, and should they still be supplemented with UVB lights?
Yeah, so that is a really great question. And there's a lot of studies being into it. Yes, when offered whole prey, you obviously have a very high calcium intake with bone content that is coming in from whole prey items like rodents or fish or things like that. And so, and that's where this debate has come up of, do we need to offer UV to snakes that are eating whole content and do have very high calcium intakes? And the hobby has shown us that no, we potentially don't need to. These animals can survive without it. But there was a recent study done with ball pythons showing that if you expose them to vitamin D3, or excuse me, if you expose them to UV lighting, their vitamin D3 levels will change. So they still have that ability to synthesize it and create vitamin D3. Now, is it crucial for them to stay alive in the hobby or even in the wild? You know, history maybe argues and shows us it doesn't, but this is where we get in the discussion, or the discussion of thriving versus surviving, right? When we don't offer them UV, these animals are surviving. History has shown us that, but are these animals thriving? Because UV does so much more than just offer the vitamin D3. It also stimulates neurological health, reproductive health, fights off fungi and bacteria. It also, just because the light spectrum that is produced offers beneficial visible lighting, which is going to stimulate neurological health and activity, and all of that. So there's more to it than just the vitamin D3. And so my personal recommendation is, yes, you should offer to UV to everything and vitamin D3 to everything, because these animals are exposed to it in the wild, and we should try to be doing everything for our animals in captivity to simulate the wild as best as we can.
Yeah, that's really great. I mean, they have access to the sun in the wild, and they can choose and have the agency and the control to utilize that sun or not. And so why would we not provide that under captive management?
Exactly. And another just fun tidbit I'll throw out there. Someone just did a recent study as well with vitamin D3 levels in feeder insects. And feeder insects and most invertebrates have the ability to synthesize vitamin D3 when exposed to UV lighting as well. And so if you put UV lighting over your crickets, that's actually also a natural way to supplement your bearded dragon with vitamin D3, because the vitamin D3 levels are going to be higher in your crickets. Now, am I going to tell you to go out and buy a $40 light bulb for your feeder insects? Maybe not. But if you want to go above and beyond for your animals, then heck yeah, go for it.
Well, and I'll add to that welfare science tells us that we have to consider the welfare of our feeder animals, as well as those animals that those feeders are being fed to. So if you want to optimize welfare for your feeder insects, it might be something that you should consider.
Yeah. I mean, you are what you eat, right? And think about, even with snakes, think about these lab rodents that we're feeding a steady diet of high fat grain, and in a neurologically non-stimulating environment, and then feeding that to your animal. What type of nutrition is going into your snake when these rodents have been offered a suboptimal life?
All right, well, thank you for that, Troy.
Yeah, no
one
problem.
Segment that we may do in every show or every few shows is called Query. And that is where one of us goes over a question we got from somebody during the week, and we give our answer to everyone. And a question that I got this week, it was actually two separate questions, but they're absolutely related. So I'll tell you both of them, is I gave my snake this hide and I've never seen them use it. So should I just take it out? The other question was, I had a vine in my snake's enclosure and the snake was never using the vine. I never saw them use the vine once. So I took it out, and now my snake is nervous and anxious and pacing and exhibiting stereotypies. So what's going on? Well, the explanation is, and there's more than one scientific paper that shows us evidence that when resources are present, it has a psychological impact on welfare. And so just the fact that a hide or refuge or a vine is present has an impact on the animal, because they know it's there to use if they choose to use it. But if you take that away, and now they know that that hide's not available, if they decide that they need it, it can cause them distress and overall generalized fear and anxiety. And so I will link these papers in the description of this YouTube video. But one of those papers is by Mellor et al. And it actually shows that the absence of resources can negatively impact welfare. And it is something that we need to be considering for zoo animals as well as livestock and all animals. So just because they're not using the hide doesn't mean that it isn't beneficial to them psychologically. And then in a paper by Evans et al. On the cognitive control of escape behaviors, that paper actually showed that the presence of a refuge nearby or not impacted an animal's escape trajectory and how soon they might escape a predator if they're engaged in resources. So let's say you have an animal that's eating in the wild and a predator comes near them. At what point do they abandon their food and flee? And the presence of a hide nearby or not impacts whether they choose to freeze or flee when that predator approaches, and how close they allow that predator to approach before they engage in some type of anti-predator behavior. And so absolutely the presence of these things impacts animals psychologically. I will mention another paper by Leotti et al., and it's on the power of choice and basically how animals and all organisms are born to choose. And it has been shown in study after study across the animal kingdom that animals prefer to have options to choose from, even if they decide not to engage in those options. And so examples of this would be if your reptile's pacing their enclosure door and you open the door and they stop pacing and sit there. But then as soon as you close the door, they pace again. And so they want that choice to opt to come out. They may not necessarily choose to exert control over that option at that point in time, but they want the ability to go in and out. And I see this in dogs as well. If any of you have dogs that scratch at the door and you open the door and then they sit there and don't go out, you close the door, they scratch on the door. They want the door open, both psychologically and literally, even if they don't decide that they're going to go out the door right now. All organisms want choices. And so just because your reptile is not using an item doesn't mean that it's not beneficial to them in some way. And so to equate this to human terms, if any of you have a nightlight next to your bed or keep a flashlight there or a fire extinguisher in your house, you may never use those things, but it might cause you a little anxiety if all of a sudden I took your flashlight or your nightlight away and it wasn't there to use if you wanted it, or now you don't have a fire extinguisher. Or what about you work from home and you have a car, but you don't leave the house for a month? And I observe that and I'm like, well, you don't need that car, I'm taking it away. That would freak you out because you want that car there when you decide to use it, even though you're not choosing to use it in the moment. So that is the answer to that question about my snake's not using the hide. Should I just take it out? No, you probably should not just take it out because they want psychologically to know that it's there if they need it, and it gives them a sense of security and safety. And without security and safety as a foundation for all organisms, we can't do other things. We're not going to reproduce, we're not going to eat, we're not going to explore, we're not going to engage in enrichment unless we feel safe. So do you guys have any questions about that?
No, but I do have an anecdotal example of that.
Oh, let's hear it.
So back when I still lived in Denver, I had I still have a female northern pine snake that I had in a 36 by 18 by 12 glass enclosure. And it was in the middle of a very busy room. It was in our living room. Zero issues behaviorally, hardly ever defensive, even for a Pituophis. Great feeding response. But getting larger, I decided to move her to a larger enclosure, which was a 4-foot Christmas tub. So a larger enclosure. However, it was opaque and she couldn't visibly see through there. So despite the fact that I maintained her temperatures and moved her to a quiet room, she no longer had the ability to actually see out. Whether or not she was ever a truly anxious or defensive or reactive animal before that, because she lost the ability to actually see out, she began to refuse meals. She became very defensive. She gave that really amazing Pituophis defensive hiss. And as soon as I moved her back into that 36 enclosure, while I finished getting her 4-foot by 2 by 2 PVC enclosure ready to go, she went right back to her usual behaviors. So just having that, it's not necessarily in the category of the myth of they want to feel always enclosed and always boxed in. They want to have the ability to see and to actually interact with the world and to choose how they want to take all that stimuli.
Yeah, absolutely. The opportunity to engage in visual stimuli outside of the enclosure should be there, but you should also give them the option to opt out of being exposed to all that. And that's why we want to clutter enclosures and give them lots of hides and lots of things in there, even if they don't use them. Which kind of segues us into Troy's next segment, which is legit or lore. What are you going to talk about today?
Yeah, so I wanted to talk on some folklore husbandry, right? Some things that are just out there and established in the hobby, but are kind of just misunderstood or done wrong. And something that I wanted to touch on or talk about are red light bulbs. You see red light bulbs used as heat sources, quite frequently throughout the hobby. There's many manufacturers that make them, and they usually all label them as infrared light bulb, and that is they do that because infrared is on the far end of the spectrum, the visible light spectrum, and the far end of the visible light spectrum is towards red in color. And so they try to associate that, but infrared really isn't visible at all to the human eye, I'll say. And so these infrared light bulbs, or these red light bulbs, were designed to use as nighttime heat sources because it was once believed that reptiles couldn't see them, that reptiles couldn't see the color red. And so you're able to use this light bulb 24 hours, offer it at nighttime to offer these nighttime heat supplementations for your animals that wouldn't bother their circadian rhythm or day-night cycle, right? And they'd be able to sleep through it because they couldn't see it. Well, I'm here to tell you that that is wrong, unfortunately. We have recently learned that most of your reptiles have incredible visual acuity. Most of your reptiles actually have 4 color receptors, where in humans we only have 3. And those color receptors in reptiles actually have a really high spike in the red spectrum. Wow, what do you know? So most reptiles can actually see the color red way better than we can. And so when you expose these animals to a 24-hour cycle of having a red light bulb, the way I like to explain it is, imagine if you went home right now and I replaced every single one of your light bulbs with a red light bulb, and I told you to live in that and you couldn't turn any of them off. It would probably drive you nuts, right? Well, we potentially can argue that that is doing the same for these reptiles. However, there has been some other folklore and myths that have been developed with these red light bulbs. Some people will tell you that it hurts your reptile; it'll burn their skin more efficiently because it puts out such high levels of infrared, or it actually can damage the reptile's eyes because of the high level of infrared or the color spectrum that it's putting out. That's not true at all. It's just that because of these reptiles' photoreceptors or visual acuity, they just really see that color red. And so it's actually a product that I do not recommend anyone use, just because they can see it very, very well. And it's something that we should try to encourage our reptile manufacturers to start phasing out, because it is just really a bad product and it's not something we could be using or should be using. And to add on to that, another one of the visual spikes, color spikes that reptiles have is in the blue spectrum, which you'll also see a lot of these nighttime bulbs or moonlight bulbs you'll see are coated with blue coatings or purple coatings. Well, those are also really high spikes in the color, in the reptile visual acuity or color receptors. So those are also bulbs that you should not be using. And it's actually very neurologically stimulating and very beneficial to offer a true nighttime and true darkness cycle for your reptiles. That truly allows them to sleep. And there's even a study out there, I'll have to find it. There's even a study showing that when you offer your reptile a day-night cycle where they're exposed to true darkness, it allows for the replication of healthy cells and potentially can prevent cancer in reptiles, which cancer is a huge problem with reptiles right now. So that is my advice. Stop using red light bulbs. And again, your reptiles will thrive because of it.
Yeah, really. A couple of things that I know are going to come up from my regular viewers is the fact that I just want to emphasize not every reptile can see in the red color spectrum wavelength.
That is correct.
So I think that Chelonians absolutely can see red. I think some lizards can see red. I'm not sure about crocodilians. But pythons and boas, which I work with a lot, see in the blue-green wavelength spectrum. But that doesn't mean that they can't perceive a red light.
Correct.
And they still can see that light in a shade. So what happens, especially like with the target training, is a lot of people you see that train turtles will use red because they really respond saliently to it. But a python, for example, is not going to see this as red. They'll just see it as gray. This whole thing, like this will be gray, but this is a darker shade of gray. So even with that light on, they are going to see light. It's just not going to be specifically a red light, and you should be giving them darkness at night so that they have that photo period.
Yeah, correct. And the other thing too that is incredibly important is just that nighttime temperature drop. You know, even for boas and pythons and I'll say even most of your snakes, you know, when you have that red light on 24 hours, yeah, they might not have the ability to see it. They potentially are seeing some light, but they're not being exposed to a temperature drop, which a temperature drop, you know, we'll go into that on another episode, but that is also incredibly important for reptiles.
Yeah, absolutely. Jz, did you have a comment about this?
No, I was just really glad that that Troy mentioned the moonlight ones, because I've never heard the tall tale of that they're quicker to burn, or they burn easier than any other hot surface.
Yeah.
But I've heard that it can damage your eyes. So go for, now they've switched to ceramic heat emitters, which have their own separate things. But I've also heard the moonlight bulbs is a good alternative, which also is not correct. And so that's why I'm really glad that you did mention the moonlight ones as well, because those are the two that I hear most often are the ceramic heat emitters or the moonlight ones.
And I do want to touch on this, you know, I want to touch on heating in another episode, but just to throw a solution out there, if you do need to offer nighttime heat supplementation, there are some new products that are coming out onto the market called deep heat projectors or carbon heat filaments. And those are going to be significantly more useful to your reptile than a ceramic heat emitter or heat pad, heat tape, radiant heat panel, because it does produce beneficial infrared while not producing any visible light. So if you do need a nighttime heat supplementation, these deep heat projectors or carbon filament lamps are the route to go.
Well, we should talk about that next time then, since we brought it up this time, and we can just flow right into our next episode with heat then.
Yeah, I would love to.
So here we're going to play a game. We always want to make this show fun. We love geeking out on reptile science, but we also want to have some fun. So we're going to do a game every episode. And this episode, we're going to do a game called Real or Ridiculous. And I did some research. And so I have 3 statements here, 3 short paragraphs that I'm going to read to Troy and Jz. And they're going to tell me 2 are real and 1 is ridiculous. And they have to tell me which one they think is ridiculous and which 2 they think are real. So since Troy just did a lot of talking, we're going to let Jz go first. Are you ready for me to read these to you?
Sure, let's do it.
Okay. So item number 1, and these are all themed. I picked museums of natural history as the theme. And so one of these statements is ridiculous and 2 are real. Number 1. The American Museum of Natural History formalized the Department of Ichthyology and Herpetology in 1909. Mary Cynthia Dickerson was the department's first herpetologist. Dickerson established a robust program of herpetological exhibition and research in only a decade, which resulted in her department being officially separated from ichthyology in February of 1920. But on Christmas Eve of that same year, Dickerson was committed to an insane asylum, where she died 3 years later at age 57. Item number 2, the University of Kansas Biodiversity Institute and Natural History Museum was established in 1900. In the 1920s, Dr. Edward H. Taylor was integral to expanding the herpetology collection there and became the first curator of their herpetology collections. But in 1954, he retired due to an illness he contracted during one of his herpetology collecting trips to Mexico. Item number 3. Lawrence M. Klauber was the first curator of reptiles and amphibians at the San Diego Natural History Museum and consulting curator of reptiles for the San Diego Zoo. He died in 1968 at age 84. In 2009, the Historical Resources Board of the City of San Diego drafted a document designating the Lawrence Klauber House as historically significant because Lawrence Klauber was a historically significant person who made significant and lasting contributions to the field of herpetology. So there are your choices. One's ridiculous, 2 are real. What do you think, Jz?
So I'm inclined to think the first one is ridiculous, only citing the misogynistic history of this country, that a woman would be the first department head of a museum. So that's where I'm inclined to think that one. However, the University of Kansas Biodiversity, that doesn't sound like an accurate term for 1909. Biodiversity wasn't really used around a whole lot during that time period, I think. So I'm inclined to think it's one of those first 2. And I'm going to go with my gut and say it's number 1. That one is the ridiculous one.
Okay. All right, Troy.
These are really good.
They
are
are
really good. I'm very excited by it. I am gonna say number 2. And I'm honestly just going with my gut here. Mary Cynthia Dickerson. I know, at least, and this could be a false memory. But I do recall Dickerson being an important name in regards to herpetology. And then Lawrence and Klauber. I know Klauber is also a potential important name in regards to his herpetology. Just because I'm thinking of Clobberi, the banded rock rattlesnake, I think is the common name. So I'm gonna go with number 2.
Okay, so you all think that number 3 is real. So we'll start with that.
About 40 seconds ago.
Okay,
yeah.
So number 3 is real. That is absolutely true. Lawrence Klauber is really known for his research into rattlesnakes.
Yep.
And he's, I think, yeah, absolutely. Like, I think collected and or named more species of rattlesnakes than anyone else ever. Yeah. And this is absolutely true. So his house is a historically significant structure in San Diego. So that one's real. Awesome. So good job, you guys. But you both disagree on number 1 and number 2. So I'm not going to go in any particular order. Let's just start with number 1 because it's number 1. And Jz, you think that one is ridiculous, and Troy thinks that one is real, and that one is real. So
I just I knew Dickerson was in there. I just didn't think she was the first head. That was what threw me off. Yeah.
And it was really a remarkable accomplishment for her, not only as a woman in the early 1900s, but the fact that she brought the herpetology department in just 10 years to such a robust state that they gave it its own department and separated it from ichthyology. But the research I did indicated that she just worked herself into the ground. Like, she was always working, like just obsessed with all of this. And she had other things going too. And she literally developed some type of mental illness, and she was committed, and she died 3 years after that. So it's really, really sad. Crazy. So that means number 2 is ridiculous. And the ridiculous part is just that he did not have to retire due to an illness he contracted traveling to Mexico. All of the rest of this is true. He did retire in 1954, but it was just because he was ready to retire. There was nothing wrong with him. And he did go on many collecting trips with some colleagues to Mexico. However, he did not contract an illness there. And so that one is number 2 is the ridiculous one. So
Okay,
I had
awesome.
a lot of fun. I had so much fun researching these, you guys.
Oh, geez.
Yeah.
I really had a good
Those
That
time.
were
was so
really
cool.
good.
Yeah, they were. They were.
But I think it was more fun watching you guys vacillate over which ones you thought were real or ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for playing. And now we are going to hear from Troy about a specific reptile that you may or may not have heard of. And this is a real reptile, I promise you.
Yeah. Yeah. So something I want to try to do every episode is just present a reptile that you might not have heard of. There are so many reptile species out there in this beautiful world of ours. And there are just so many crazy ones that a lot of people haven't heard of. And the first one, or the one I want to talk about today, is called the tentacled snake. Their scientific name is Erpeton tentamaculatum. They are a small, fully aquatic snake that comes from Southeast Asia. Full grown, you're looking about at an 18 inch to 2 foot snake. Like I said, they are fully aquatic, and how they get their name is they actually have 2 little just tentacles, right, coming off their rostrum or the tip of their face there. And it's funny because scientists actually don't really know what those 2 tentacles are used for. Potential thoughts are to aid in hunting or aid in prey acquisition. Also, it's potentially believed, a lot of them come from murky waters, so they potentially use those tentacles to find their way around in that murky environment. But they're amazing snakes, and they use a very unique style of hunting, where they actually will hang down with their head below the rest of their body, and they'll kind of create this hook or candy cane shape, right? And then they'll wait there, and when a fish comes along and bumps into the side of them, they'll actually flinch their body and redirect that fish towards their head, and then they strike to the side and grab that fish, and they have a very, very fast strike. And then they also are rear fang venomous, and that venom is very specialized towards fish. Because I don't know if I mentioned it, but these guys are pescivores. They only eat fish. But it's a very, very unique hunting style. You don't see that hunting style in really any other snakes, where they make that hook and strike sideways opposed to striking head on. They're also a live bearing species, and average litters can be around 8 snakes. If you are local to Colorado, we do have this species on display at Denver Zoo. So feel free to stop by and see if you can find all the snakes on display.
I remember when the zoo very first got them, it was so cool to sit there and watch them.
Yeah.
They hadn't really started to display that really cool behavior the first couple times I visited, but I know exactly what they're talking about. They're such cool little animals.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I really appreciated being able to see them when I came up to the Denver Zoo, and they just look so different from any snake that I work with.
Yeah.
They were just so fascinating. They almost didn't strike me as a snake at first when I saw them. And I think that's because of the water environment, the aquatic environment, and because of the tentacles. Really, really fascinating. So what color do they tend to be? And do they come in just one color or multiple colors? And do they ever come out of the water?
That is a great question. So they tend to be kind of a mottled green color. But there are some individuals that have been a brown or light brown, and most of them have a reticulated pattern. But there are some individuals in the wild that have striped patterns, and those striped individuals tend to be a lighter brown, which has led to the discussion of, is there different localities or potentially different subspecies within the genus? But yes, and then what was your other question?
Well,
do
do they
come out of the
stay
water?
100% of their time in the water, or do they ever come out?
Yeah, they I'll say they spend 99% of their time in the water. but I have observed individuals coming out and basking and drying out on land, but they usually don't spend very much time on water because they're very awkward snakes. You know, when you dry dock them or put them on land, they cannot slither very well. They do not get traction very well, and they usually just kind of sit there and wriggle. But they are very fascinating because one of their defense mechanisms is to go rigid. And so when you pick them up out of the water, they go completely rigid. And you know, the idea behind it is they're trying to act like a branch or a root. And so animals potentially won't see them as a food source. They'll just think they're picking up a stick. And so it's very, very unique. Because yeah, with most snakes, you pick them up, they wriggle, they squirm, they slither around, but these guys are like a pole in your hand. It's pretty unique.
That's really cool.
So do they breathe air or do they experience cutaneous breathing?
Nope, they breathe air. And so they actually will do this behavior that's called bobbering. And they'll inflate their gular pouch or just the pouch right below their bottom jaw. And they will potentially use it as a bobber to lift themselves up to the surface of the water where they will gasp air. But you know, because reptiles slow metabolic rate and how they utilize oxygen, they have the ability to hold their breath for extended periods of time, upwards of over an hour. So
how specific is their microclimate then? Since they live in water.
Yeah, it's very unique. So we'll talk about, you know, we touched on ectotherms at the beginning of this episode. There are different types of ectothermy. And whereas these snakes are actually poikilotherms, so they don't thermoregulate throughout their environment, they just kind of adapt to their surroundings. So, you know, because they live in water, they don't really have the ability to go over here and be in some warm water or go over here and be in some cold water. They just kind of survive and adapt within the water temperatures that they're in. So their water can drop down into the mid 60s in the wild. But it usually hovers around kind of the mid 70s is what they stay in, and getting high as 76, especially during potential breeding seasons and things like that.
So it's a very specific part of the world where they can be found. They couldn't just live in waters anywhere. And so these are freshwater snakes or saltwater snakes?
They're freshwater snakes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, they're certainly interesting to see. And I really recommend if you guys have a chance to see any in person that you go and you take advantage of that. Yeah. So this has been really fun. I enjoyed this so much. And as we wrap up, we're going to ask each other some questions.
Yes.
We
do. So, Lori, what is one thing that a reptile has taught you working with reptiles?
Absolutely. The first thing that comes to mind is patience. Patience. Because I can tell you as an animal trainer, working with dogs and horses, for example, if I call them to come to me, like they're right there, like the dog bolts across the room and they are sitting in front of me, or that horse gallops to me or trots up to me. And so I'm used to them moving quickly and I can go through training exercises quickly, but you can't do that with the snake. So I do call snakes to come to me, but it might take them 30 seconds. It might take them a minute. If it's a rainbow boa, it might take 8 minutes, which is, I think, the record. One of my rainbow boas did recall to me following a target, but she took like 8 minutes. So I learned that I have to really slow down working with snakes and some other reptiles like turtles, and that you just have to work at their pace. And I've actually found it very relaxing. And I think I'm a better trainer and behaviorist for that. And I feel like overall, I'm a more content and calm person because they have taught me to slow down and not get in a hurry about things and just let things sort of happen. Well, I do have the Pituophis here. I have a gopher snake. I have a bull snake. I do have corn snakes. I have an Aesculapian snake, a Korean rat snake. So I have a false water cobra. Now she's the exception. True. When I ask her to shift, like she exceeds my speed. Like I'm not quick enough for her. Like I can't get all my equipment. She sees that target and she's like, I'm there. And she's got her mouth open and she's going to eat the target if I don't have her reinforcement there. Yep. So there are exceptions, but in general, reptiles have taught me patience. So I have a question back at you, Jz.
Yo,
What is a recent challenge that you've had with one of your reptiles?
so we're gonna stick with the theme of rainbow boas. So I have two separate buildings. So I have most of my more temperate and tropical animals in this big building that I'm in, but the cooler weather animals that typically don't bask at higher temperatures and maintain at a lower temperature range, they're actually in the building that I live in, and I call that the jungle or the gecko room, because there's a lot of like Rhactodactylus and crested geckos in there, as well as small old rat snakes and the rainbow boas, because they also prefer that lower temperature range. Well, what happened was I have a small juvenile female Brazilian rainbow boa in a 4-foot Christmas tree tub. It's fairly translucent with locking hinges, because I don't have quite a 4-foot cage ready for her yet, an actual true PVC like the two adults that are sitting below her. But being in the part of Colorado that I am, it is subject to kind of weird temperature fluctuations. And so we actually got a pretty good cold spike that I needed to actually add an additional heater to. And so adding a heater into there, I had to mess with the humidity that I had going in there. And so the weird mix of the added heat and humidity actually caused the plastic to bow in just slightly enough for her to pop out and get out. And so what I had to do is, remembering all the things that I've learned about how they behave, when their periods of activity are, the temperatures of the room, the temperatures that she's been kept in for the last year and a half, where I would go in specific times of the day to go look for her. And within about 30 hours at the time that I chose to go in there, I found her immediately. Yay!
See, nice
Escapees
job.
do
And you
happen
used
under the
behavior.
best circumstances, but you can use
So
your
you-
knowledge of snake behavior.
Yeah, you accurately predicted her behavior and you found her.
Yep.
You were thinking like a rainbow boa. Well, this has been fun. Troy, you have a closing phrase for us?
Well, everyone, yeah, this has been so much fun. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to just have some discussions about reptiles, reptile husbandry, and advancing our reptile husbandry. But I just want to say we really appreciate your time and your commitment to helping our animals thrive.